Hi, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. This is the Future of Diplomacy Project Study Group with our Fisher Family Fellow Ambassador Peter Wittig, who was supposed to come physically on campus, but we are engaging him virtually online as much as possible. So thanks to him for his time and thanks to you all for coming. Peter Wittig recently retired from the German diplomatic service. He's a 5-time ambassador. He served in Spain, at the UN, in Lebanon and Cyprus before working in the cabinet of 2 foreign secretaries at headquarters. Most recently, he was the German ambassador at the United Nations in New York, representing his country in the Security Council. He was the ambassador in Washington and in the United Kingdom. His expertise include the Middle East region, conflict resolution, multilateral organizations, transatlantic relations, and European affairs. So thank you very much, Ambassador Wittig. This is going to be an interactive session. I hope everyone did their reading. So I'll hand it over to Ambassador Wittig. And if you have a question, please raise your blue hand and we'll get to you or use the chat. Thank you.
By the way, I prefer Peter to
Okay.
I got rid of that title in a way and that role. But Erika, thank you. And it's wonderful to meet all of you here online. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me, first of all, to be part of that Kennedy School community, and then also to interact with you in this study group. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Well, first of all, thank you, Erika, for your guidance and your help in the past week and weeks. I don't know whether we mention a lot the Republic of Cyprus, because you're a specialist, and Erika just published a paper on the Cyprus issue, and I could relate to that because I was ambassador there and envoy to this intractable Cyprus issue. So thanks, Erika. And I also want to mention that we have a brilliant specialist here in the room on transatlantic affairs, Catherine Kluber. And I also want to tell you that Catherine has become something of a star in German TV and broadcasting with a tremendous skill. She presented all the enigmas of the American electoral system and around the election in the German media. And I'm sure, Catherine, you already booked out for 2024. So please feel free to chime in at any time, Catherine, and stimulate the debate and supplement my comments or contradict if you feel like it. Now, before I start with my input, I want to preface this by a remark or two. I'm coming to this issue of transatlantic relations in the future, and I thought this is a topical issue to talk about. I come from this from a practical angle as a practitioner, as a diplomat. So my claim to fame, if I have any, is not that I'm a professor of international relations. I'm not, although I have the highest respect for all of them, especially in the Kennedy School. But my sort of claim to fame is rather a certain kind of street credibility in diplomacy over the years. And the second thing is I also come to this topic with a certain bias. I admit that. I was happy that President Biden was elected, but I try to restrain myself here as much as possible and be objective. But in that sort of bias, I think reflect what most of the European leaders and the foreign policy and security community in Europe has felt. So it's not some personal thing. It reflects also European mainstream, with some notable exceptions. In terms of countries, the exceptions are Hungary and Poland and the Prime Minister of Slovenia, who really put their money on a Trump presidency too, and also some of the political forces, the populist, right-wing populist forces in our parliament also would have preferred another extension of the Trump presidency. But this is not only my bias if it shines through this, but it's also probably the mainstream of political forces in Europe. So let's start with our discussion, and my input is about 15 minutes. I hope not longer. Now, the European Union and Germany in particular had tremendous stakes in this election. In the case of Germany, and I can testify to that personally, we came to probably the lowest point of our bilateral relations to any US administration since the Second World War. I served my country there from the election to election of Trump for another 2 years. So I could feel that how much Germany became incrementally sort of a target of this president, with some explainable reasons for that. The huge trade surplus that Germany accrued vis-a-vis the US, and also what the president felt was an underperformance, a rather dramatic underperformance in his view of our financial contributions to NATO and to the defense effort. But there was more to it, and in recent times we had the feeling, and many had the feeling, that there was sort of punishment at work in his various actions, like threatening to impose car tariffs on German and European cars, or a uncoordinated not previous consulted withdrawal of parts of the American forces in Germany, etc. So it had come to a quite cool relationship, if I may say so. And of course, we now hoped with the Biden win and the Biden administration, this will change. And as far as the European Union is concerned, it didn't really fare much better in the Trump years. Trump didn't hide his, well, let's say, skepticism or indifference, and in some cases even hostility to the European Union. And I remember very well, especially at the beginning of the Trump administration, I spoke to a lot of cabinet members or advisors of the president. They were not very experienced, some of them in international relations, and they, most of them considered the European Union either as a non-entity or as a failed model. And that was worrisome to us. It's always a challenge to explain the complex structure of the European Union to any American leader. But in this case, it was sort of an outright sort of antagonistic view to the European Union, exacerbated by Brexit. So the European Union was seen by Trump much more as a rival than an ally, and that of course was a big concern for all of us in Europe. Now this will change. I think we can be certain that Biden appreciates the EU not only as a trading partner, sometimes also rival, but above all as a factor of stability and of democracy on the continent, and also as an opportunity for the US to project power and influence in that part of the world. And so he will pivot back from Trump's view, which was really a break in the tradition of American policy ever since the Second World War, and the approach was always to support the European community at first, and then union for strategic reasons. And Trump had broken with that, and I guess there's a certain rebalancing now under the Trump presidency. Now there are high hopes in Europe now, and I think one has to somehow put this great expectation into perspective and call for realism. And we know, of course, that Europe is not as important for the US anymore as it used to be. The center of gravity clearly is Asia, and the most strategic relationship that the US will entertain in the next decade or decades is the one with China. So Europe has to adjust to that new geopolitical reality in the world. That's probably, you know, the first constraint for dreams and hopes that we have. And the second is that, of course, we know that the Biden presidency in the beginning will be overwhelmed by domestic challenges, and foreign policy, security policy will not be center stage. And then, of course, there's also a fact that the US will not be wanting to be the world policeman anymore, and so European conflicts will not be high on the agenda for this administration. However, what we can expect and what we do expect, and this is not trivial, is a complete change in style and tone and interaction. And this is clearly important for leaders, also for diplomats, and in a way it also is important for the societies in our countries. So we hope and we expect, and I'm sure we get it, a return to credibility, to reliability, and to trust, and trust in among allies in diplomacy is really the main currency, if you will. Now, but atmospherics only take you so far. So there is a need, I think, to rebuild and maybe more than that, to reinvent this transatlantic partnership. Now, smart people have advised, Bob Zoellick, for instance, who is an old transatlanticist, has advised that the most promising approach to re-energize transatlantic relations in the short term is to make the connection with the immediate US domestic priorities of the new president and his administration: health, economic recovery, and maybe climate policy. So I think that's a good advice, sort of for low-hanging fruits of building trust. Certainly those issues are not low-hanging fruits in terms of their problems, but I think they lend themselves to establish in the short term a new sense of cooperation. So we could really coordinate our actions on COVID with the help of the World Health Organization, to which I assume Biden will return. We could also harmonize our action for global economic recovery within established institutions like the G7 or the G20 or beyond. And also, I think that is very important. We can use this tremendous symbolism of an American president returning to the Paris Climate Agreement, and he said he will do it on the first day of an administration. We can use that to really galvanize support for transatlantic or for a new transatlantic partnership. I know that there's much more work to do than just signing up for the Paris Agreement, but in this part of the world, especially among young generation, the issue of climate change ranks top. There was a poll the other month in Europe asking what is the most important issue in transatlantic relations, and it was not COVID, not health, it was climate change that came first. So this has a tremendous potential to build a sense of commonality again, and to restore global leadership in the international climate diplomacy and policy. So, but apart from those early, I think, connections that we can make relating to the problems that the president faces at home, there are, of course, big structural, hard issues, if you will. And I just name three: security, trade, and China. Now, we have an interesting debate right now as we speak almost in Europe about the significance of strategic autonomy in security affairs in Europe versus a stronger reliance on the US. And the proponent of this first position, strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty in security affairs, is the French president. And he comes from a very Gaullist tradition, as we know, although he is not a conservative. But he also appeals, of course, to the French political tradition of strategic autonomy, and he rings the alarm bell on the state of NATO. He thinks, as you might remember, he once called a couple of months ago NATO brain dead, and he thinks NATO is not the model for the future. Now in Germany, we have a different, most of the leaders and foreign policy experts have a different view, and the view is that, a fundamental experience of the past is still valid, that Europe will not be able to guarantee its own security without the US. We can't match the nuclear and conventional military capacities that the US has. So I think this issue will be important to solve within the European Union, but also in the transatlantic relationship. We need to, and I have to speak to my own, German fellow countrymen here. We need to do more on defense in terms of burden sharing, in terms of spending as part of the GDP, and we need to engage more in security challenges in our immediate neighborhood in Europe, meaning the Middle East and the northern part of Africa. And we need to do that more than we did in the past already. Now, we will probably have a very early NATO summit here. And I think the assignment here also in that early NATO summit is to, from the American side, reconfirm the US commitment to NATO. President Trump had, uttered some doubtful, remarks on collective defense pledge. I think the US should recommit itself, and the European countries and Canada will have to recommit on their goals, their targets of defense spending. Second big issue is trade. I think it becomes ever more important in this world where protectionism has surged. And I think here Europeans are great beneficiaries and advocates of a rules-based international trade order and also free trade, although they have not such an untarnished free trade tradition. European Union can also be pretty protectionists on agricultural issues, for instance. But this is what has contributed to our prosperity in Europe and in Germany. So Biden pledged to stop the global slide towards protectionism, but he was very cautious to commit himself on a free trade agenda. So we should not expect too much from him there. Also being aware that the impulses to be protectionists are pretty strong in the US, and they might have also grown in Europe with the pandemic. So we should not harbor here unrealistic hopes that we can return or subscribe all to a free trade agenda. We should rather focus here on what's doable, and then maybe a year or two into this presidency, we can expect maybe a new effort to engage and negotiate a less ambitious free trade agreement than the previous one that failed, the TTIP. And there are some issues that are solvable: steel and aluminum tariffs, and Airbus, Boeing, SPAT, etc. What is very important is to tackle the issue of taxation rules for the digital economy. That's a potential fault line, and also probably institutionally the most important issue is reform the WTO, the World Trade Organization. That is something the Europeans really want to see. They want to stop the descent of the WTO into irrelevance. That's kind of the symbol of the rules-based trade order. So hopefully we can make some headway on the reform and revitalize the WTO. Now, the last point I want to make here is China. Now, I think everybody now understands, and also in Europe, that the rise of China is the single most strategic challenge for the US in the next decades. And we, the Europeans, should not expect Biden to shift dramatically in his China, in the China policy of the previous administration. We know full well that getting tough on China is sort of was the order of the day in Washington. There was a kind of bidding war, who's the toughest on China, and that cannot be undone. But Europeans probably will expect a kind of rebalancing in the American approach to China, rebalance the cooperative elements with China, and they relate to global issues like climate, like non-proliferation, etc. Rebalance those cooperative elements with the more antagonistic, the competitive elements, or the confrontational elements vis-a-vis China. And there are, some issues where we have fundamental differences, and there are also threat perceptions emanating from China. We know them all, from Hong Kong to the South China Sea, and human rights issue in Taiwan, etc. So I'm not saying that the Europeans will plead for a softer approach to China, but for a more nuanced and freshly balanced approach. And I think the US will look at Europe as an ally that is expected to side with the US, and every move that we make will be tightly scrutinized, whether this is a move towards China or towards the US. In Europe, there is a fear, not only in the business world, but also in the political spectrum, that with this increasing antagonism between US and China, Europe will be caught in the middle. And this is not a good place for us. Think of sanctions and listings, etc., where we can only lose. And we also hate the idea, the Europeans, of a decoupling of the two economies. That would be to our detriment. So I think there's a lot at stake here of the transatlantic, in transatlantic relations, on how we position ourselves. My hope is, and I'm encouraged by a couple of articles that I've read of advisors, and I had also some personal contact to my former colleagues and friends who are now with the Biden campaign, that Biden, at least the entourage of Biden, will favor a kind of outreach to the European allies and Asian allies on China, and we'll try to formulate sort of a common agenda of our grievances and how we deal with them in relationship to China. And I think that's the right approach. And I just wish we could come to such a point. It needs some preparatory work, and I think this is where we do have to do some homework as much in the security field as on China, also within the fold of the European Union, where we are far from united in our policy vis-a-vis China. But we should come to the US then not empty-handed and clueless when the moment comes, but we have to prepare such a common agenda that we want to pursue with China. So I think I stop here and just say, in a nutshell, we should not, I think nobody really does, we should not expect a return to the good old Western order as it is nostalgically called. Maybe it was never so good, but in any way we can't sort of revitalize that or go back to that old order. It's to a large extent, it is history. But Europe and the US continue to have really big strategic interests to renew and strengthen the transatlantic relations, not the least because we are sharing values. We are both democracies. And this is also sort of a mission beyond our transatlantic relationship. It's a mission to strengthen democracies in the world and to stop the surge of authoritarian rules in the world. But to rebuild trust, yes, that's possible. And as I think an easy win, but also to pursue a joint global agenda that I, marked a little bit. That is, the bigger, tougher job to reinvent that transatlantic relationship. And we can't foresee whether this will be successful, and only time will tell. But I hope leaders are already frenetically working on this agenda, and I hope we can all contribute a little bit to it. So I will stop here, and hopefully you can come in and contribute and ask, and hopefully we have a spirited discussion here. Thank you.
So if you have any questions, yeah, great. So thanks, Izzy Ernst, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Erika, and thank you so much, Peter, for your time. This is really interesting. I'm Izzy. I'm a German student at HKS in my second year of the Master in Public Administration program. I'm just curious. I mean, you've laid out a pretty steep agenda for the transatlantic relationship. There's a lot to be done. I'm also conscious that there's an election in Germany next year. So if we're thinking about what that means, it's really the Biden administration is going to have about 9 months to engage with Merkel's current government. How do you think is that going to shape the priorities on what to focus on first? Does that mean it will be easier to just focus on the low-hanging fruits and then see how the government is going to shape out in Germany and go from there? Or does it make more sense to actually tackle the big strategic questions and engage on the more complicated things like trade in China?
Mm-hmm. Well, Izzy, you're right. It can be very discouraging if you look at the map of elections ahead of us, because there's always an election. There's an election, there will be an election in Germany, then there will be an election in France, it never stops. And then there will be the next election in the US. So it's a very discouraging picture. So, but I agree with you, those are sort of important milestones. And the window of opportunity, this is an overused expression, but I use it. The window of opportunity is not very big. Also from the perspective of the president, of President Biden, the president-elect. It will take some time until the new team is in place and confirmed by the Senate. It might take longer than desired, and then, in no time, maybe in 18 months later, there's already the midterm elections looming large at the horizon. But to come back to your question specifically on the election in Germany, I think we have quite substantial foreign policy disagreement between the center-right and the center-left. For instance, on defense spending, the center-left is not a fan of increased defense spending. When President Trump said he wanted to thin out the U.S. forces in Germany, part of the left said, yes, great, we didn't want to have you here anyway. So there are important fault lines, but I trust that there is still a mainstream that says let's work as closely as we can with the US. And I'm sure the next chancellor, the successor of Chancellor Merkel, and the jury is still out who that is going to be. I mean, first of all, the party of Chancellor has not made up its mind. And secondly, there's yet an election to win in September next year. But the probability is high that it will be once again a center-right politicians, from the party of Chancellor Merkel. And the probability is also pretty high that they will then enter into a coalition with the Green Party. And the Green Party, and that would be a first for a national government in Germany. But I think the society really is ready for such a coalition. And the Greens are, I would say, more pro-American than many of the Social Democrats, the center-left, while they are more pacifist than some of the center-left political representatives. So it will not be easy with this new government, but the short answer is there is still an important large consensus also on security policy, that we need the US, that we want the closest possible relationship with the US, and the temptation sort of to go it alone with Europe, or even to have an equivalence in vis-a-vis China in the US, that temptation is not very strong in Germany.
Thank you. Jose Luis de Colmenares, who is a fellow with our project on Europe. He comes from the Spanish Foreign Ministry. Please. I think you're muted.
Yes, no, am I? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Grüß Gott, Botschafter. You've put so many issues on the plate that I almost don't know where to start from. But since my concern and my research is dealing with populism, I'm really keen on how do you see tackling head on the challenges that populism bring to the European political space. My experience with Germany in Central Europe has been more of a, if not a muted response publicly, at least centering more in privately engaging those leaders like Orban. Do you think that there's going to be there's a need to tackle this in a more clear manner? Don't you think that maybe we should be a bit more vocal about this? And since I have you there on the other side of the screen, do you think that this, if not decoupling, but these Trump years are going to mean effectively that the Europeans will strive for greater impetus to integrate sovereign competences, a bit like we did with Maastricht.
Mm. Yeah. First of all, dear colleague, great to have you here. Two difficult issues. Populism. I don't have a recipe here. It has been on the rise, and that I think that is also a reason why there was among political leaders such a critical view on Trump, because he seemed to have inspired and supported and actively encouraged populist forces in Europe, and we saw, as we were used to see America as the beacon of democracy and rule of law, we all of a sudden saw a president who encourages, as it was perceived, sometimes anti-democratic forces also in Europe. And with a new president, I think we can be absolutely sure that this direct or indirect support for populist or authoritarian leaders in Europe will stop, and that's already a big step. And I harbor the hope that the Biden win, although it was rather a tight win, will help to halt this surge of populism almost everywhere. I have no recipe how to combat populism in Europe. I can sort of analytically say the birth of this populist surge in Germany was basically the refugee crisis, and so this is what galvanized support of populism, and then all kinds of underlying sort of underground political currents emerged and raised their sometimes ugly head, like anti-Semitism. The social media contributed to this polarization of the political discourse. So the algorithmic architecture of the platform did a tremendous damage to the political discourse. So there is a multiplicity of reasons, and I just think it's important that America can once again lead by example as a democracy, and as a hopefully once again credible leader, and can display some democratic leadership for the world. So that's an unsatisfactory answer, but I just know that we have, every country in Europe will have to do a lot to contain populism, be it sort of in more societal work, be it in an outright condemnation by the leaders. Sort of, I think there are many layers here to go about. And now the crisis as an impetus for integration, that's an interesting observation. And I think if you look back at the development of the European Union, which is such a complicated and I would say unique and sui generis construction, has been progressing, ironically, with surmounting crises. And the recent ones are, the Euro crisis, or the Greek debt crisis, refugee crisis, of course the financial crisis also, and now the Corona crisis. And so every time the European Union struggled with its complex and cumbersome decision-making processes, I mean, many summits were necessary, and through the night negotiations, etc. And at the 11th hour, they agreed on something. But it all also contributed to a piecemeal reform, be it in, with after the financial crisis, a banking union, or the road towards a capital market union, or in this latest one, stepping over two red lines from a German point of view in allowing, sort of fiscally speaking, a mutualization of debt, and in basically in coming up with an enormous recovery program that costs a lot of money to all the member states and will benefit mostly those who were hardest hit. So that was if you will, a kind of a transfer union without carrying this name explicitly. But so the European Union in this crisis also stepped into new territory. So I agree with you in a way. This crisis we have at hand, Corona and economic recovery, has strengthened the European Union. And I forgot Brexit. After Brexit, the fear was, okay, Brexit will be emulated by other countries, and there will be an exodus of other countries. The opposite basically occurred. The cohesion in those negotiations with the UK was very strong, because there was a fear that this cohesion would evaporate. So people ganged up together even more than before. So I'm not a pessimist on the progress of the European Union. It will never happen in a big bang. We will always have only sort of painful, incremental, if you will, baby steps forward, but it will happen. And I'm actually pretty sure that we come out of this Corona crisis stronger than before as a union.
Thanks, Ambassador. Lennart Kuntze.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Peter, for offering the study group. My name is Lennart. I'm a second-year MPA student from Germany. Mm-hmm. My question is about the situation regarding China, and you mentioned that Europe is in a tricky position, running the risk of being caught in the middle. And there will doubtlessly be decisions that Europe will be pushed to take, be it regarding Huawei, be it on other strategic decisions toward China. At the same time, of course, Trump having been elected with 10 million more votes than in the election before isn't a great signal that there's a fundamental shift in the US, but more a signal that there might be the risk that in 4 years we're going to be back to where we were with Trump. So since all these decisions that Europe will be pushed to take will have quite a long time span into the future and will sort of have a certain path dependency, how would you suggest Europe to go about this? Is it really now to trust that this situation of reviving transatlantic partnership is going to hold for the foreseeable future, or how do you suggest to go about this tricky situation of having to balance being caught somewhere in the middle between the US and China and having to take sides on some of the issues?
I would advise not to think about the election in 2024 right now. I think we should grasp the opportunity that is presenting itself to us, and then hope that this will yield good results. I know, and I can't exactly understand what you mean. I mean, American society is deeply polarized, and everybody knows that this will not be over in the short run, and there might be another pendulum swing in a couple of years. But I think the task of leaders is to grasp that opportunity. Now the relationship, this triangle, US, China, Europe, is a very complex one, and is probably the most decisive single factor in moving forward in the coming decades. We have in Europe, we have different interests than the US. Not all the way, but we do have an interest to engage, to continue to engage with them, not only on big issues like climate change, but also on business. This is potentially the biggest market in the world. European industries are export-orientated industries, and in particular, Germany has huge stakes in China. Now, if we would be, and I don't believe it will happen, we would be moving into sort of an Iran situation with China, where American sanctions will be ever more tightened, and in the end, European business is confronted with the situation. You choose either Iran or the American market. If you want to, enter the American market, you have to drop Iran. Now, you could also say this would be the worst case if that antagonism US-China continues, that the Europeans would be faced to choose between China and the US. I think that would be very detrimental to not only to European businesses, but to employment and what depends on that. And it would also be bad in terms of using economic coercion, which has become such a popular instrument in the US. And you mentioned Huawei. That's a little bit of a different story, but we have observed a very trigger-happy Congress in terms of sanctions. The proliferation of sanctions emanating from Congress is enormous, and that has something to do with the differences or the changed approach in terms of military engagement. The less the US does in terms of military action, the more the sanctions are the tool of choice to put pressure on countries. So this is a fault line here between Europe and the US. The ever increasing amount of sanctions that, because of their extraterritoriality, that also concern Europe directly, and maybe just a small bridge to Russia. This is something, of course, that it's an issue yet to be resolved. How to deal with the sanctions of U.S. Congress against the pipeline Nord Stream 2. That's a big issue in Europe, and I don't expect any reversal of that decision because it's a bipartisan decision in Washington. But this kind of economic coercion, as it is called, vis-a-vis Europe, can be tremendously hurtful to establish a trustful relationship. So to go back to China, I hope, and that's what I really expect the leaders to do, we can come up with a joint agenda, what we pursue together, US and Europe, on China. It would give us really a lot of heft and clout and strength vis-a-vis China.
Christian?
Thank you, Erika, and thank you, Peter, for taking the time for this discussion today. It's been fascinating so far. You mentioned
fellow countrymen here. I take it you also are from our beautiful homeland, right?
Yes, I'm also an MPA student from Germany, and in the first year at the moment. But I think we'll have some non-German voices thereafter as well, hopefully. Yeah. You mentioned trade as one of the three big structural issues. And there's, of course, the multilateral, but then also the bilateral perspective between the US and Europe. And on this bilateral side, it seems to me that firstly, there's a framing question, and secondly, then there's hard content issues. One thing that I've wondered for a long time on the framing side is whether the European Union could be better and stronger in moving away from this excessive focus on pure trade in goods and reframe the debate in a wider trade perspective that also includes, services and license fee payments on digital trade, that actually makes this perceived deficit in the bilateral relationship go away completely. So what makes that diplomatic effort difficult or possible going forward now? And then secondly, on the substantive side, between tariffs on the one hand and then digital service taxation on the other hand, and the EU privacy or the privacy shield for data transfers having been struck down by the European Court of Justice, it seems to me that there are a lot of substantive issues that would benefit from being tackled relatively quickly. At the same time, it's not clear to me whether there's enough of a zone of agreement to handle that in a short time frame. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on those prospects.
Yeah, Christian, I think you talked about framing, but you framed this very well, the challenges. You pointed to a very important development, sort of the traditional trade focus on goods, which really are basically tariffs and quota, which are not such a big issue really for our highly mature economies, but the issues that have not been covered so far, and you named some of them, like digital trade or data transfer or the financial service sector, for instance, they have not been covered traditionally, neither by bilateral free trade agreements, nor does the WTO has much to say in terms of regulation on those modern forms of economic interaction. So I agree with you that we should not just, when we try to re-engage in trade negotiations, that it should not be like the TTIP, another try to get TTIP done. This would not be successful. We will have to have a different kind of more modern trade relationship, and also maybe start from a different angle, because these days civil society is so sensitive to trade issues. It used to be a kind of expert subject, to be negotiated in back rooms, and then the public was somehow not really aware what was at stake. And since TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, where the chlorinated chicken was the most debated issue, food standards are everybody's business. It's sort of the stuff for dinner table talk. Ever since that time, trade agreements have a tremendous echo in the civil society. So we cannot, again, hope to have a successful trade agreement with this approach. And we need to focus on those modern issues, standards. The EU is a good regulator in terms of standards for data, for artificial intelligence, etc. But e-commerce, data transfer, those are the modern elements. And I think if we give it another try, a lot of what you have said will have to incorporate it in those trade agreements, and maybe we can do it in a less sort of ambitious way, and not try to include everything. Like agriculture is usually one of the hardest things because the lobbies are so strong, or procurement, getting access into government works and projects. It's something that's, you know, President Biden said, you know, let's buy American. So there's not much headway to be made in those traditional spheres. So I agree with you. Let's reframe this.
Great. So Oleg.
Thank you, Erika, and thank you, Peter, for your time today. Boris Johnson just a few days ago announced this ramp up in defense spending in Britain on the order of something like £17 billion over the next 4 years. And, you know, I think there's multiple factors there, right? So the rise of authoritarianism, there's cyber threats, you know, probably I'm sort of speculating also, you know, for the first time since World War II, we have borders changing by force in Eastern Europe. And I would also think that there's some domestic factors there too, you know, defense employment in Britain, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I'm, you know, assuming that this increased spending holds in Britain to sort of team up with the US and kind of, you know, maybe serve as an example potentially. How do you see, you know, defense or security issues shape up and within the European Union in the coming, you know, several years? You know, you mentioned the differences in opinion between, you know, the German leadership and the French leadership. How do you see that evolving over the next several years? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think a comment on the UK, and I served there until May of this year, and I could also get quite a deep look into UK's domestic policies. I think Boris Johnson is not shy in making big announcements, big projects in the midst of a you know, very serious COVID crisis that is really affecting the whole social tissue of the UK. It's probably the worst managed corona crisis, or one of the worst managed corona crises in Europe. So I would also interpret this as a sign that he wants to look into the future and wants to reaffirm the idea of global Britain as an independent security actor with a lot of clout in military forces. I mean, he at the same time announced a 10-point plan for green Britain, which also cost a lot of money. I personally think he's right in shining light on that task. But I mean, in a time when UK is running unprecedented amounts of debt, it's pretty daring to suggest that this kind of defense spending would be necessary and would be wildly popular by sort of everybody in the UK. But that's a personal comment. Now, the more decisive issues for Europe is what you suggested, the difficult trajectory that is ahead of Europe in terms of defense. I mean, one of the reasons why most German leaders are skeptical towards this notion of European sovereignty is that we know the obstacles to a fully integrated defense policy in Europe. And my personal experience is this will not, again here, we cannot sort of establish a European defense force, not an integrated European defense force like a like an American army, but not even sort of a composed defense force like the NATO forces in Europe with all the capacities that an autonomous, strategically autonomous force would need. What we can do is create synergy, harmonize our defense system, our defense industry, step by step. I think Europe has something like 25 different infantry systems, and in order to harmonize that, it takes time, and there's a name for it. It's called PESCO. I don't know what it stands for, but it means basically a cohesion of existing European defense capacities and bringing them into one system over time. There are about 42 projects to do that. And I think that's a very difficult trajectory where the devil is in the detail. So this is one path ahead, and it's not, again, it's not sort of a big bang, but small steps towards a integrated European force. But the more more principled fault line is the one I mentioned between Macron and sort of the more NATO-minded countries of the European Union. I trust that Macron's contributions to this debate have always the intention to shake up a little bit, to wake up the sleepy Europeans and to point to weaknesses strategic weaknesses of Europe, and that doesn't. And I hope that those Macron interviews that he usually gives don't mean that he turns his back or turns away from NATO. I don't think that would be a promising path, and I don't think he will pursue that path. But the debate continues, and in the end, we will have to find a compromise.
So we have a question in chat from Lennart Kuntze, is that how you say it? An MPP from Germany, who says, you mentioned the need for Germany to take up more responsibility in foreign and security policy. What does it take to make this actually happen? The main reason for a sense of urgency in this regard will leave the White House in January. Do you think there is enough outside pressure as well as internal public support for this new leadership role of Germany?
Yeah, the leadership role of Germany, that is a oftentimes posed question. And I think, again, here, it's the answer is complex. We will be moving slowly to more leadership. We have to, it's a fine line that we have to walk, and a balancing act. If we are too assertive in our leadership aspirations, you elicit immediately old reflexes about German hegemony and Germany being too big for Europe. If you do too little, Germany is chided by sort of dodging the issues and sort of focusing solely on its economic success. So it's a very fine line that you have to walk. And if you look at the past, we have been incrementally in Germany stepped up our international engagement. We are now participating in more missions. 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable, for instance, in delivering lethal weapons to a war zone, as we did in Iraq when the Yazidis were under attack. We're now participating in really warlike missions in the Sahel, supporting the French forces there were fighting terrorists. So we have moved. We have to move more, but we have to also, people outside Europe have to be mindful that this is a sensitive area. Too much German leadership means you elicit counter reactions. And even this leadership together with France, they call it the couple franco-allemande, meets a lot of resentment by smaller countries. So the European Union is a strange animal, you know. Everybody wants to be part of it, but then everybody also craves for leadership, and this is the dilemma that we have to solve pragmatically. And I think the next chancellor after Merkel will probably face calls to more visible leadership in security and defense issue, and I hope he can step up to it. He or she, but it's probably a he.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We're joined by my cat. You could see him. I think Catherine.
Catherine, yeah. Catherine, you should come in.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I just put something in chat just to add to Peter's piece about, and this might be more relevant for the non-Germans and the Germans on this call. But for all the, I think, rightful criticism that's vaunted against Germany, I think Peter made a good point about how the debate in the country has moved on, and how we have, in part over these past 4 years, and I say this for the European dimension as well, you know, after about 2 years of just complete and utter shock, effectively, at what was going on in the United States, there's been a maturation both in the European political context, PESCO, the projects, various other initiatives, even the muscling in the digital arena, and the regulatory power that the European Union has put forth. And we have 2 pieces of digital legislation that are coming forth in December. I mean, there's a lot of movement, but in the German piece particularly, I do think that we've seen, you know, and I've talked about this a number of times now. About 15 years ago, a German president decided to voluntarily leave office because he made the outrageous claim that German interests, security and economic interests, might have to be defended in the Indo-Pacific region. And that seemed so crazy, frankly, for the European, or for the German internal security debate at the time, that Horst Köhler decided to leave his office. And here we are, you know, 2.5 months out from the German Foreign Office putting forward an Indo-Pacific strategy. So that's just to say that Germany, especially over the last 2 years, has taken a much more global approach to its own role. And so what I refer to now is, in German, I call it a Scharniermacht, which is to say it's really become a hinged power and has realized that, you know, to keep it in casual American English, Germany has to walk and chew gum at the same time, which is to say it has to invest in the deepening of the European integration project, but it also has to begin to formulate not only global interests, which is a complete departure for German foreign policy, but also German ideas on how to address the transnational challenges that we face. And so I do think that both in German foreign policy and in European foreign policy, in retrospect, we might think that this sort of moment of cataclysmic shock that emanated from the White House over these past 4 years have actually led to a situation where we have greater maturity in the relationship, where, I mean, everything that all of you have raised, you know, are very clear points for collaboration, for docking, for ways to meet in a more eye-to-eye level across the transatlantic table. And I think that ultimately gives me optimism for all the pessimism I have, and many people on this call have heard me talk about it in the last couple of days, for all the pessimism I have regarding the current situation in the White House and in the surround, whatever you call the sort of democracy eroding things that are going on at the heart of the White House and in this country. Generally, for the transatlantic relationship, it gives me great optimism, in part because the Europeans have so much more to put on the table than they did 4 years ago.
Is Karl Kaiser, do I recognize Karl Kaiser here? Yeah, Karl, you are the ultimate authority on transatlantic relations. Why don't you?
I've been around for a long. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, very good. I would like to pick up on what Katrin just said. The shock of Trump, although we're deeply worried about the negative implications, at least had one positive impact, that it made the Europeans realize that on many issues, they cannot rely on the US. Now, that has instigated a process. I would go so far that the enormous taboo breaking of American economic policy within the European Union by accepting the notion of grants owes something to the fact that Europeans are shocked by American policy. So I think German, you are quite right. German policy is moving in this direction, but as Katrin said, there's a long way to go, a long way to go. And I happen to agree with you when you think of defense. There are so many areas where the Europeans are simply unable to take care of themselves. Think of the role of American intelligence in the European defense policy. The Europeans simply don't have those instruments. Think of the fact that the whole nuclear umbrella will remain indispensable. It will go very, very slowly. And when you look at the PESCO projects, they're not unimportant, but they really do not establish what's called strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy does not exist in the military field, and it is unlikely to exist for a very long time to come. So I think one should be realistic. I think the notion of aiming for more autonomy is a very good one, because it means you build up capacities to be able to act, but act usually in contexts where you do need some sort of support from Atlantic allies, and notably from the United States. So that's going very, very slowly. I think what matters now is that we return to something that was missing, civility in relations, which was totally absent. The way allies were treated, and you in your article in Foreign Affairs, you pointed that out quite well. The fact that allies no longer count, this zero-sum thinking in alliance relations, that's going to end. Again, we are going to have an American president who will listen, who appreciates allies, and who, unlike Trump, understands that American power is enhanced by allies. And that will change everything when it comes to thinking out jointly. You know, Peter, that in the better days, the telephone between Washington and Berlin, or earlier between Bonn, was constantly running. Everybody knew each other. When there was an important decision, you talked to each other. That's all stopped under Trump. That will be resuming once Biden is in the White House. And that gives us a much better chance to deal with all the current issues. And I would like to come back and ask you the China policy with the new administration coming. Obviously, it's going to be a very competitive relationship. There are enormous problems. Where do you see communality? What should be the process in dealing with it? How do we rebalance the necessity of some cooperation with China, for example, on climate and on pandemics, with the necessity to really oppose Chinese expansionism and basically the effect of splitting the European Union through its Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah. Erika, was that a question to me because he was not audible for a second, or was that a question to Catherine?
I believe it was to you. We have one more question from.
Was a question for you?
Okay.
We have one more question from Julian Haworth, who's also affiliated with our project on Europe. So if we could take all three.
Yeah, maybe we take the three together.
Professor Haworth? I think you're muted.
Unmuting, yeah, I'm unmuted, I think. Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Peter, for a very stimulating talk. You emphasized the word reinvention rather than returning to the past, and you have said, and many, and just about every commentator in Europe has said, it's become a truism that there is no return to the status quo ante. So I'd like to push you a little bit more and ask you to say what exactly needs to be reinvented, and what exactly is it that we cannot return to? And I'm thinking in particular, trade I'll leave aside, that's a whole other issue, but I think the issue of NATO and China are in fact linked here, almost inextricably. And you set up a sort of a rivalry between those in Europe who feel that some sort of strategic autonomy is both possible and desirable on the one hand, and there are a lot of them, and those who sort of fall back on saying that, Europe could never possibly manage without the military inputs of the United States. Those two positions seem to me to be fundamentally incompatible. Now, I would suggest that a way of going forward is that we should see the transatlantic relationship in a very long historical and geographical perspective. Europe and America have been through 4 different phases in their relationship ever since the birth of the American Republic. Some of them have involved wars, some of them have involved other things. The Cold War was a relatively small period, short period in this long history, where we had a discourse about shared values, we had a discourse about identical interests, and so on and so forth. That period has gone, and ever since the end of the Cold War, we've been trying to find a new balanced relationship. And I was very heartened to hear you say again and again, we need new balance, we need a new equilibrium, we need to find new ways of cooperating. So it's really on that I'd like to push you and see whether you can be a bit more specific about the reinvention part of this. I agree with what's been said by several people that the European Union on its own through the common security and defense policy is going to get nowhere. That will not deliver strategic autonomy. However, I think that the objective of strategic autonomy some way down the line is both healthy and necessary and normal. There's no reason on earth why the European Union should forever, ever, ever, for the rest of time, be a protectorate of the United States. So we have to have that ambition there and tread a really fine line between going too far and not going anywhere.
Erika, do we have a third question?
No.
No, okay. Very, very thoughtful questions and comments from Carl and Julian. What is the reinvention element? I think it relates. I mentioned 2 aspects. It relates to NATO. NATO cannot be, as it used to be, basically an alliance against the threat from the East. It needs to evolve, and it has evolved already. And it's also an alliance against the threats from the South, meaning basically the terrorist threat that emanates from the Middle East or Northern Africa, and the security engagement in those regions. And here I see that there has to be a rebalancing. There is a retrenchment of the US that we can see, a long-term retrenchment from the Middle East and also from parts of Africa. I don't see the US ever in the foreseeable future re-engaging in important security challenges in those regions. And I think the Europeans just have to get used to the notion that there is a new division of labor here. And for instance, in Libya, which is a huge security threat, it's also relates to our security in Europe as far as, you know, refugees streams and infiltration of terrorists is concerned. Libya is probably mostly a European issue. And likewise, there might be more Libyas in our neighborhood where we will have to bear the brunt of the burden. So that is something new, and their sort of a European leading role is much more the order of the day than it ever used to be. And the second sort of reinvention, I think, is our relationship to China, the US relationship and our relationship, because I think that will dominate the international relations much more than Russia, for instance, in the future. And you know, this administration, for instance, introduced China as a threat to NATO. I remember in one of the last NATO foreign ministerial meetings, Pompeo, in his statement, didn't even mention Russia once in the threat perception, but mentioned China all the time. So what this administration was, you know, doing, you know, openly or by stealth, was already redirecting NATO vis-a-vis or reintroducing or introducing rather a Chinese perspective or remit in NATO's in NATO's assignments, so to speak. So I think that also might be a trend to watch. And now I come to Carl. What is the trajectory? Where do we formulate? How do we team up on China? And I think here, I think you have to you know, distinguish the various dossiers. We have important grievances, common grievances on vis-a-vis China, investment restrictions, IP, intellectual property theft, cyber attacks on our businesses there, the strategic acquisitions of Chinese in our countries, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, overproduction of steel and sort of illegal practices according to WTO. So there's a host of issues we could pursue together, but without using those coercive measures that the Trump administration has used, engaging into trade wars and basically go for a managed trade, which is not in line with WTO standards. So here we have a broad trade and economic agenda, which would not lead to a decoupling, because I think decoupling is really the wrong path to take of the economies of the Chinese and US economies. But we would have an agenda where we can be rather robust as US and Europe, with a lot of clout within the body of the international law. And of course, there's another bulk of issues. How do we deal with China's assertive, ever more assertive regional role, and maybe one day also global role? I named those issues: Hong Kong, Taiwan, the Uyghurs, and the above all South China Sea, and there are other issues. Now that's more that you can't, put in one notion. We can only say, yeah, let's be robust in countering this new Chinese, or you can also say renewed Chinese assertiveness, but there is no recipe here. We just have to go case by case. Do we want to impose sanctions on China, or do we police more frequently the seas around China? Do we have more military exposure there? Do we strengthen our allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia? Do we diversify maybe also business-wise? Are we overexposed in China and rather go to the adjacent southeastern Asian countries? So there's a host of issues, but I think this is something worth talking about on a high level early in the administration to formulate a joint approach to China. And that is also a reinvention of the transatlantic relationship. And I think it will be high on our agenda, whether we like it or not, in the coming decade.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We're just about out of time. So thanks for leaving on a relatively optimistic and hopeful note as well. Please join me in thanking the Ambassador for his time, either virtually or you could just, he will be our fellow again in the spring semester. So expect more of these study groups and other opportunities to engage with him. Thank you very much. Be safe, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Erika, and thank you for everybody for being part of that group. I enjoyed it tremendously and hope to see you again also in person, maybe next year.